seen it's been in decline in advanced economies like the UK for some time. As I mentioned before, coming out of a crisis, you don't want to have this massive, people losing their jobs, because there isn't necessarily that confidence and the growth to make a smooth reallocation. And we know that people don't necessarily travel for work because of social ties to the places where they are. I think there are opportunities, however. So thinking now about the firms that are in place now, we found that there was this path dependence, as Bart said. If you'd previously adopted technologies, you were more likely to have that initial positive response in the pandemic. And also larger firms, of course, were more likely to respond in that way. But will we see actually there's some positive impact of this experience, whereby firms are now shifted onto a more innovative trajectory where they'll continue innovating? Or will it be actually this was just a one-off and they'll embed this new technology, but actually everything else will kind of go back to normal? And I think that's where we need to build that understanding, but also it's where government policies and support will actually make that difference, so that we actually can leverage that opportunity rather than let it go to waste.
One of the impacts of the pandemic is that we have basically all learned how to use video conferencing, as you said, and presumably we'll only carry on using it if we find it of benefit to ourselves, and if we don't, we'll stop using it, and that will differ from person to person and company to company, but overall that will be a benefit, presumably.
Well, I think there's actually some, so at the individual level, that's where surveys at the individual level are very useful, and Nick Bloom and others have recently done surveys of UK employees and found that there is a general consensus now that about 2 days remote working is kind of preferred by many, obviously in professions where this is feasible and where it's an option. And actually, there are questions there about the particular type of work that might actually be more productive in that way. And it's actually quite specific what they find. Very, very large meetings are perhaps less effective in that way, whereas small ones with, say, 4 people where you can see everyone on the screen are fine, or something like this where it's very structured. So I think there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity even within firms and within occupations. And you would just hope that there can be a new equilibrium that actually can work without excluding certain types of workers or exacerbating those inequalities.
It might be also useful to quote some of the latest numbers from the Office of National Statistics on this, because it's actually quite interesting to see now that 50% of workers in the UK are already back to work, in person. So there's a very significant group that has gone back to that. The number of people working from home entirely has gone down from 37 to 22% now. And there's about the 15% of the working population that is having this hybrid model. And I think there the key questions to Anna's point is, can companies actually manage to deal with this hybrid model? Because frankly, it's the hardest one. Having everybody in the office or everybody from home, at least for office type of functions, it's much more easier to do than this hybrid model. So companies are really at the moment working very hard in terms of HR practices to make this work. I do believe, like Anna, that the percentage of hybrid workers, so people working partly from home, partly in the office, 5% before the pandemic. It's 15% now. I think it could very well go up to 25% or 1/3 of the workforce, but we still need to realize that 2/3 of the workforce is likely to be back at work at a minimum once the pandemic is over.
Giles, can I bring you in? So what do you see as the impact of the pandemic on productivity? Anything to add to the points being made?
I mean, one of the really interesting points you made there, and has been illustrated as well by Anna talking there, is the policy discussion between trying to help companies that don't do the right things to move up the ladder a bit versus trying to work out why they're not going bust. And this is something that we were really puzzling about for many years before the crisis. And the concern was, well, I mean, it's nice, the idea that we create some agency or something that might help push people towards the right policies, or a tax break or training or something, but why on earth is the market not working? And the policy that dare not speak its name was the one where we should look at all of the different implicit subsidies that encourage companies to remain small, like our quite high VAT threshold, or policies like the employment allowance, and ask ourselves whether they're kind of giving a subsidy for being not kind of good enough. And those not good enough companies are a drain on the other ones that are competing with them. So what would be interesting for me, I mean, it's again a very flinty-hearted thing, and I fully accept Anna's warning that you don't want to have a mass insolvency when the rest of the economy can't support all of the dynamism that you need. But ultimately, the way the market adopts better techniques is if you don't, you get out competed by your rivals. And it strikes me that we need to be thinking about why that hasn't been happening and whether the coronavirus crisis might at least be a jolt towards it by making the returns much more extreme. And it shows why it would have been a terrible political spat, but this is the sort of mechanism that is the one that works long term, not government schemes that help people take up the right IT techniques.
Yeah, I think you're not going to get many.
Sorry, Anthony, we lost there. You're back.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think you're going to get many politicians saying we need more companies to fail. But, I get your point. I just want to broaden it out to technology more generally. So not just about the pandemic, but we've the last few years, decade, but really the last 5 years have been characterized by increasing focus on digitization and big data, real rollout of advanced technologies that didn't exist 10 years ago. But it clearly hasn't had any impact on the aggregate productivity, at least not that we can notice, or otherwise maybe productivity would have gone down without it. But there seems to be a bit of a puzzle here about all this amazing technology and the fact it doesn't really show anything in technology figures. So I was just wondering how you reconcile that. Coming to Bart van Ark first, and then Anna nodding away. Coming to you next.
Sure. No, that is, of course, one big part of the productivity puzzle. I think, first of all, to realize that not all technologies that are being invented are driven by R&D. Some of them are just based on incremental innovations. So we should be careful not to sort of align research and development spending with technological opportunities. But particularly the latest technologies that you're referring to in a minute, they're amply available. The problem really is the absorption of those technologies within companies. Now, to a large extent, this is work done by companies. So I very much agree also with Giles' point earlier. If companies are not very successful in adopting these technologies, then I think at some point they just need to leave because they just don't have the right competencies. However, the question then is, why is it that they don't have the right competencies? And it turns out, again, referring back to this long tail of less productive firms, that we have a relatively large number of firms compared to other countries, where we see that they're kind of locked in particular regions, particular areas in which they're operating. They're not growing their markets, they're not scaling up. They miss the management competencies. They don't have the connections with other firms that are more productive. So the role for policy and government really here is to basically facilitate the connections between firms, between the education sector, which is absolutely critical to this, and between government at a very local and regional level. A lot of this cannot be done at national level, but is really dependent on local and regional activity and activities in the devolved nations in order to create what we sometimes call these ecosystems, where companies and the business community as a whole, the education community and the government can connect and drive innovation and skill generation. So in my view, a lot of the technology challenges that we're seeing is not the fact that the technology is not available, not even that it doesn't get diffused, but that it doesn't get absorbed by many companies. And we need to facilitate companies that can do this in order to make it happen, and indeed let companies that will ultimately fail to do this to let them fail.
Do you think, just coming back to the point about the UK's productivity being less than other countries, do you think that diffusion and absorption of technology is worse here than other countries? Does that explain part of the productivity difference?
Yeah, I think a lot of the research has shown that the long tail, so again, the large number of companies within sectors that are not close enough to the frontier, is very much due to the fact that they don't absorb technologies properly. A lot of that related to management competencies and to lacks of intermediate skills in the workforce. So again, for these new digital technologies, companies really need to restructure themselves. They less hierarchical, a much larger part of the workforce gets engaged in using this technology in order to produce new products and services. So skill changes and management competencies are really important here. And yeah, I think a lot of the research is showing that the UK is really behind that in several other countries, explaining that long tail that I mentioned before.
Thank you. Dr. Valero, you're nodding away on a lot of that, but do you think the UK does have a problem, particularly with absorption of new technologies?